Hi, I wanted to go over some features in CS5. Today I wanted to get into the tool palette and talk about it a bit. One thing I'm going to do right off the bat is change this palette so it goes to a two-column rather than a single column. I'm working with a low enough monitor resolution for screen recording that we're losing some of the stuff at the bottom of the column or at the bottom of the palette. So I'm going to just pop this open just so you can see the other items in here, and then I'll talk about those guys a little later this way. But for most of the discussion, I want to talk about the way that you'd see it, and it's going to look more like this in a single column, so I think that'd make it easier. But in any case, the tool palette in Illustrator is your primary way of getting work done. Illustrator is very palette, or I should say panel. They started changing the definitions or the terminology a couple of versions ago. These are now panels. Anyway, Illustrator is a very panel heavy application. Most of what you do will be inside either the tool panel, which is on the left side, or in some of these other panels that are over on the right side. You'll notice that, and I'm making a separate movie about this, but panels have a couple of common properties. One of them is this kind of expand and contract double arrow, which is real handy for being able to take care of screen space. But before I get going, I wanted to show you just demonstrate for you a couple of different keyboard shortcuts that you might use. I'm working on a Mac here, and if you use a PC, it's still going to be pretty much the same tool or keyboard shortcuts for this one. The keyboard shortcut I'm thinking of is if you press Tab, it hides all of your palettes, and if you press Shift Tab, it hides your panels over on the right but leaves the ones on the left. So good couple of keyboard shortcuts to know. If you press F, it does a couple of different things with your screen. So notice when I press F multiple times here, I get just the screen. I don't get the menus or any of that. So if you want to display your work at any time to to somebody who's coming over and taking a look, obviously that's kind of a nice handy thing to have. Or some people just like designing in a kind of non-cluttered way. Anyway, so let's get back to panels though. The tool panel, when you're looking at it, it breaks out into kind of a couple of different areas of usefulness. The top four have to do with selection. The black arrow and the white arrow have to do with selection of objects. I'm going to go ahead and just make an object here so you can see the difference. So there's an oval with my black arrow. You see that when I click on the object, it selects the entire object. Now if you go under View, and what I want to do is hide the bounding box, notice that the object is still selected, but I can't select just part of an object. If I draw a marquee, notice that it selects the entire object. It's up to you whether you want to have hide bounding box on or off. I think people sometimes, when they're starting to work with Illustrator, misunderstand the difference between the black arrow, which is the selection tool, and the white arrow. So I like to have people turn that off just so that they can see that difference. With it on, notice I can resize and do things, and if you're not used to Illustrator, you might think that you're actually modifying just a part of the object rather than scaling the object. So anyway, that's my rationale. You choose what you want. So black arrow or the selection arrow, notice that it shows up down here. Also, if I hover over it, it'll say selection. In those cases, it selects the whole object. Direct selection, which is the white arrow, will select part of an object. Now if I click away and click back, it looks like it's pretty much doing the same thing. But if I come over the edge and I click just on one anchor point, notice that just that anchor point is selected, and obviously the segment's going into the anchor point. If I click and move this anchor point around, the rest of the object stays put, and I can therefore modify part of an object just by using the white arrow. This is what vector objects do. I mean, vector objects are made out of math, and basically a whole bunch of real complex calculus is going on while we're dragging these little Bezier handles around. So if you never liked calculus, here's a reason to enjoy it, I guess. But in any case, the white arrow alters parts of an object. If I have multiple objects, and let's make one a different color. Okay, I can use the magic wand, and when I click with the magic wand, it'll select other objects that have the same fill or stroke. So that's what the magic wand does. Again, more selection stuff. And then finally there's this lasso tool, which I've always found to be just kind of a silly little Photoshop. We need to, I don't know, it just seems like they're trying to tack on a Photoshop tool into Illustrator. That's if you want to select this little guy here and then come all the way around and select this point here. You can use it with the lasso tool. Notice they both modify. Now, why I can't just come in and click on one and then hold down Shift, click on the other, and do the same thing with the white arrow, I guess is just too complex. So they made that tool, but you'll find that you hardly ever use it. Okay, so let's say we're working and building something. I've just got the pen tool out here and I'm just making a shape. Don't worry that I'm making a shape right now and how I'm going about that. But if I want to access the last selection tool for a limited time, if I hold down the Command key on the Mac or the Control key in Windows, notice I get the last arrow used. So it's either going to be the black or the white one. I always like to make a habit of setting the arrows to white so that as I come back and do these quick selections, I can modify a shape, or I can click and move an entire shape just by clicking on the fill. So to me, the white arrow is just so much more usable than the black arrow because it can do both jobs, and I don't even have to pick it up. I can just keep working along and hold down Command every once in a while. As you saw, the pen tool, its purpose is to build shapes. So I'll explain Bezier handles and that stuff in another video, but suffice it to say that if you start with a pen tool and you think it's going to work like a real pen and you start trying to draw shapes, it gets real frustrating because it doesn't work like that. And that kind of brings up the next area here. This group of tools, I call them my creation tools. I don't know what Adobe calls them. The key, though, is that you'll notice there's a little divider line between the last selection tool and these creation tools, and then there's another divider below it. So all these tools in here are there for making stuff. So you've seen kind of closed shapes. And by the way, any tool that has one of these little arrows on it means that you can click and hold and it'll pop out and you'll get more tools. So if I get out the star tool, notice I can open that up, and that does the job. So any of these tools that you want to goof around with, you can. There's the blob brush in here that came out, I believe, with CS4. If I draw over part of the shape here, I can modify the shape, and if I come back with the white arrow, notice that it's actually modified the outer edge of the shape. So it's not just drawing on top of it, it's actually modifying the shape by altering its edge, the vector edge of it. So that's the blob brush. By the way, when you're using these brushes, it's just like Photoshop in that you can use the right and left bracket to adjust the size of the brush. So real easy way to make some adjustments. And then of course the eraser functions in a similar manner, just the opposite way. And again, I can increase or decrease the size of the eraser the same way. Just go in and this cuts away at the vector edge. Again, if I hold down Command, you'll notice it leaves a whole bunch of little vector points all over the place. So we've got a whole bunch of creation tools in here, and we'll go over them as we walk through class, but the pen is by far Illustrator's most powerful tool. So that's the tool to learn. Type, there's all kinds of type. The most basic is point type. When I make point type, notice that it lands on a point. That's why they call it point type. And by default, it'll just keep on going and going. It doesn't rewrap. Now, the other way that you can do point type is if I click and drag out a box with the type tool. Now that type is limited inside that box. So it works like a text box. Okay, line tool, there's a line tool, an arc tool. Again, you can goof around with these. By the way, with any of these tools, if they pop out like this, you can tear them off by coming over and clicking on this edge. Okay, so with these items pulled out, you can have your own little mini panels or palettes there. So again, notice that with the arc tool, as I click and drag out, it builds an arc for me, and so forth. You'll notice that as I'm doing this, you don't see the arc after I click and drag to another one. Right now, it doesn't have a fill, or I'm sorry, a stroke applied to it. If I pop this out, we can take a look, and you can see that there's actually no fill or stroke applied. So we'll talk about that in a second here. Let's look at this guy. Down at the bottom, you'll see this even with a single panel. You've got fill, which is the large rectangle, and then stroke is the thing that looks like a picture frame. Whenever you see a red slash like this, it means that there's a fill or a stroke of none. So if I wanted to change this so that this item had a stroke color applied to it, I'd bring it forward. Again, you just click on it to bring it forward, and then apply a color. We could use the last stroke color that was used, or the last color used, period. I could come over into the color panel and pick a color. Either one of those would work. Notice we've got these little icons. You'll start to remember these different icons. This one is for strokes. If I click that open, I can increase the size of the stroke. There we go. And if I click away, we see we got the green stroke. So anyway, if you ever notice that some of these guys, we have phantom things drawn and they disappear, it's just because the fill and the stroke are nothing right now. So you just go ahead and give them a color and set them up, and you should be good to go. Okay, so pencil tool is kind of like the pen. A lot of people gravitate towards the pencil tool first because it feels like something you know, right? You get it out and you click and drag with it, and it works like a conventional pencil. Kind of, but not quite. Notice that as I move over part of the shape with the pencil, the little X by the pencil tool goes away. That means it's going to modify this shape. So if I redraw it, notice that the shape's been changed. Now this is pretty cool most of the time, unless you decide to change direction. If you turn more than 90 degrees here, so if I come back over here and I think I'm going to be adding to this by going back this other way, the pencil tool thinks that you've just redone that stroke and puts it up here. So that can be kind of confusing. And this gives me a chance to bring up some tool palette options. If I double click on an object in the tool panel, sometimes there's extra options in here. So for instance, notice there's a couple of things in terms of editing where it says edit selected paths. If I turn that off, now when I come over this, notice that that X stays there no matter how close I get. So if I come back and I draw other lines, it's just making new lines on top. Sometimes that's handy. That's the way you want it to go. I suppose the other thing you could do is set a tolerance for that, edit selected paths, and just crank it down so that you have to be quite close to the path for it to actually work. If I do that now, notice that X stays there pretty close until I get really close to the object. So some things to know about, but I guess the key thing here would be the fact that that there's an adjustability here, and with many tools it's like that. I wonder, I would just double click and see. Yeah, so for instance, Paintbrush gives us that kind of thing. While we're on Paintbrush, let's look at that. I'm going to click away. I want to get out our paintbrushes. Let's just pick a calligraphy brush. So if I get out a calligraphy brush, you'll notice it works by the way that it's been designed. So if that's a silly statement, but if you look at this, it's rather flat. So if I draw on one angle and then cut back a different angle, I get a slightly different quality in the line stroke. So that's something to consider as well. There's multiple brushes that you can use. There's these are just kind of art brushes where they've made a shape and the shape gets stretched over the whole object. There's the calligraphy brush I mentioned before. New with Illustrator CS5 is this bristle brush. Bristle brushes are kind of cool. As I click and drag and draw, you'll notice that it actually looks very rastery, meaning that it actually has this quality about it that makes it look more like it should be coming from Photoshop than Illustrator. The reason it's rotating and moving around is I'm using a Wacom tablet here, and it's picking up on the variation on the stylus that I'm using. So I can hold this down. Let's see if I can get this. And you'll see I get a different look there. It's almost like I've got a brush and I'm pushing right down on the canvas with it. So that's another reason why you might use one of the Wacom tablets or Wacom tablets in our department. So anyway, these are all creation tools. That was kind of silly. I guess I should have. Let me draw out this star here so that we've got something to look at. By the way, you can reverse fill and stroke. Notice the stroke here is green, the fill is white, or none. Just reverse it by clicking that arrow. Now, there's the next set of tools that we've got are transformation tools. The most basic one is the rotate tool. Rotate tool works by clicking, and you've got a point of rotation. You drag, and it rotates around that point. You can move in and actually click and drag that point of rotation, and then notice that once your cursor changes, it now rotates around there. Or you can just click and let go. When you click and let go, it changes the rotation point. The next tool over is the scale tool. Notice it uses the same rotation point or pivot point. And now if I click and drag away from that, it gets bigger, or as I click and drag towards it, it gets smaller. So that's kind of how the scale tool works. Let me undo this back a bit. If I put the pivot point right in the middle of the object, and then click and drag out, you notice it grows kind of uniformly around that pivot point. Holding down Shift constrains it. Shift constrains in Illustrator all the time. Here's a cool one. If I let me drag out an arc here, let's just apply the little green stroke. This is new with CS5. There's a width shift tool. If I come in, I've drawn a little segment. Right now the segment is uniform in its width. If I click and drag out, what it does is it opens up that stroke in that area. And I can click and drag out again and make an adjustment. You see it's just making these little points on here. So you can start with a basic shape and build it out from there. The free transform tool is the next guy up. It allows you to do rotation as well as scaling. One reason why I also don't like the bounding box, showing the bounding box, is I think people get confused between it and the free transform tool. They look very much the same, and sometimes there'll be things that you'll want to do with the free transform tool and you think you're working with it because you're seeing the bounding box. Okay, so a couple of other tools here. Shape Builder. This is new with CS5. Let's say, why don't I get out just a couple of basic shapes here. You know, on occasion what you'll do is you'll build shapes out using simpler shapes. Let me come over here. By the way, if I hold down Option to draw, draws from the center. Alright, so let's say I've built kind of this shape, looks kind of like a P. You can use Shape Builder to merge them together. If I come over and click, notice it starts to merge them together, and it merges them all. And I can merge those guys, I can build the whole thing. To be totally honest with you, illustrators have Pathfinder for years, and I've always found Pathfinder to do exactly the same thing. I think where Adobe's headed with Illustrator is to make more of its tools interactive. Rather than using a command, you actually work with a tool interface instead. Then we have a couple of tools here. There's a perspective grid tool, and then there's also a perspective selection tool. The grid tool is kind of cool. If I come in here, by default it makes a little 2-point perspective. If you've ever had a drawing class, you've probably suffered through perspective drawing. I always thought it was fun, but some people don't like it. So if I can click and drag this around, notice I can increase the grid. I can change where the vanishing points are. Let me move down a little bit here. I can lift up the bottom by adjusting that. Bring down the top. Okay, so big deal. It looks like you've got this object. Now, here's kind of the neat thing. If I pop this out, there's this perspective selection tool. Well, notice right now the little right side has been selected, and that's the right side of the grid. If I click on this object, I can click and drag on its ends, and it moves around in perspective. Notice how it's now working within perspective. It gets smaller as it goes down there, it gets bigger as it slides along. And if you do show the bounding box, let's see, let's go back to show bounding box here. If I show the bounding box, I can click and drag and scale the thing up, and it scales in terms of this object. Now, let's say I want to put that star on the left side here of the perspective, just click on that, click on the star. Notice it's now diminishing, and it's working along this perspective grid. And again, we can scale things up. And if I move them up in space, notice how the star subtly changes as it's going up that edge. So that's kind of a neat addition. There's a lot of technical drawing that goes on, and I imagine something like this really saves a lot of time for stuff like that. But again, these are your transform tools. Then there are a couple of tools here that kind of defy definition. There's a gradient mesh tool. If you put in a gradient mesh, you can then color some of these different mesh points, and you'll notice it bleeds out across the shape. And we'll talk more about that down the road. Gradient tools. If I choose this guy, I think I have to apply a gradient first. So I'm going to come over and just apply a default gradient. Let's see if we've got one in here. There's a default gradient. It's all black though. Let's change these colors. Notice that I've got different colors on the gradient. Or different handles on here. If you've ever used any of the little shapes, let's drag that out a bit. Sorry, I'm kind of babbling to myself. You'll find that I tend to babble quite often. Okay, what I'm going to do is replace one of these colors with something from the swatches. So I'm going to click and drag down, drop it on there, and now you notice that the gradient is transformed. This is kind of that interactive stuff I was talking about with Illustrator before. Notice that this used to be the old way you did it, and now with Illustrator, I think this started in CS4, you have the controls directly on the screen for you. So you can click and drag these around, you can move them where you want the gradient to be. I can lower it or raise it up, and that adjusts the start point. Let's see, this is the midpoint control as well. So there's your gradient. It's interesting. The gradient doesn't go in perspective. I would probably have needed to do that before I put this on the perspective shape. But again, little tools to do slight modifications. If I have, if I like the color from one object, let's say I like this green coming over from this shape, and I want to apply it to the shape I just made here, I can get out the eyedropper tool and click on that shape. Now you might say, well, why isn't it filling with green? Well, remember, this is a stroke that's got a modified width on it. So what it did is it gave it a fill of none and a width of this green, or a stroke of that green color. Just undo that real quick. There's a blend tool, the symbol sprayer tool, graph tool, lots of different little tools here. Let's jump down to the last bit. These are kind of, I guess, document-wide tools. One is this idea of artboards. So you'll notice that my artboard right here is just defined as the page size. Right now it's a letter size page. Now I can drag this around and it'll adjust this artboard. It'll make this bigger or smaller. Now, of course, I need to have the right paper to be able to print this stuff, or it'll just scale. I can print and scale it down to a different paper size if I want. But what an artboard does is it allows you to define the usable area versus the non-usable area, the live area, let's say, versus the work area. So for example, I've redefined the artboard. Notice that the right edge and the top of this star are outside of that. If I save for web and devices, notice that those things are cropped off by where the artboard cropped to. So that's kind of the purpose of the artboard. There's a slice tool in here, and this has to do with slicing images up for web delivery. So it's not the same as like chopping an image up. You'll find tools like that under the eraser. And then there's two tools here that you should never have to use. They're great tools, but again, there's keyboard shortcuts for that. If you hold down the space bar, you'll notice that you get your little grabber hand, this tool right here. So hold down space bar, you get that temporarily. You can move things around, piece of cake. If you hold down Command and space, I get a magnifying glass. And then I can zoom in. So now I'm using the magnify tool. If I hold down Option and space, Command Option space, I get demagnify tool. Now I can zoom back out. So by knowing a couple of little keyboard shortcuts, Command for the last arrow used, Command space for the magnifying glass, Command Option space for demagnify, and space bar for the grabber hand, I can skip using the tools up here and the tools down here. We've kind of already talked about fill and stroke. As I mentioned before, you can reverse fill and stroke. If I click on this object, notice that it's now giving it a fill. And by the way, when you have open paths like this one, the fill just goes from one edge of the path to the other. And reverse it back. Now we have a stroke rather than a fill. Down here stands for default fill and stroke, which is kind of neat. You can click on that and it just sets it to this white fill, black stroke. I want to do that. Right down below that are the last items used in terms of color, gradient, and then this is where you can also apply a background of none. Then there's kind of a neat thing that came out, and it came out with CS5. Let me click on a shape. Here's this little guy. If I click on this middle shape, and let's hover on it, that's draw behind. So if let's say I draw out a circle here, and let's give it a fill so you can see what's happening. Notice that it's drawn out behind this shape. Now you could also send to front, send to back, that's fine. But it's a little quick. And then the other thing you can do, let's come back here with this guy. I'm going to click on the third little button. This is draw inside. This is basically a clipping path. So if I get out, for example, let's use a pencil and give it a fill, or I'm sorry, stroke without a fill. Oh, I'm sorry. I wanted to have that selected and click away. And now with my pencil tool, sorry, need to know what I'm doing. I'm going to get a stroke, no fill. Notice that there's these little dotted lines indicating that when I draw, it's going to draw inside of this. So now I'm drawing with my pencil. Notice what's happening is it's being cropped by that shape. Illustrator again had this previously. This is called a clipping mask, but by being able to make it interactive like that, it's a lot easier to work with. I can go ahead and get out of that mode, just normal drawing mode, and now if I draw with a pencil, it just draws normally. So there's kind of a quick breakdown. And the last little guys here are the screen modes I was telling you about, and that's if you press F, it'll cycle through those. Anyway, tool palette, it's a great big huge help in Illustrator. You're going to do, as you saw, a whole lot of work from it. You might also come up to the options bar and work in the options bar as well. But you're going to find this tool to be, or this panel to be, extremely handy. All right, let me know if you've got questions. The next little movie I was going to make is on just panels in general.